Thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor to present my work at the joint session. And it's particularly nice to be able to have a dialogue with Keith on panpsychism. If someone had presented a paper on panpsychism at the joint session, say 30, 40 years ago, maybe people would have laughed at it because panpsychism was not taken very seriously then. But in the last 10, 15 years, panpsychism has attracted a lot of attention, and now there are many prominent scholars defending, partially or fully defending panpsychism. And many people think that now panpsychism is one of the most promising solutions to the hard problem of consciousness. And I'm quite attracted to panpsychism myself. I think it's a very elegant view of reality and consciousness, but at the same time, I think this view faces a serious problem. And in this paper, I want to explain this problem that I think panpsychism faces. So in this paper, I focus on a specific form of panpsychism, which is called constitutive Russellian panpsychism. According to this view, micromaterial entities have phenomenal properties which constitute the phenomenal properties of macro entities, and they represent the intrinsic natures of micromaterial entities. So this sounds very complicated, but I will spell this out later. I want to focus on this specific form of panpsychism because I think this is the most standard form of panpsychism, and it's also a quite popular form. And my main thesis in this paper is that constitutive Russellian panpsychism reaches a cognitive dead end. So even if this view is true, it seems impossible to show how it is true. And I focus on the three elements of constitutive Russellian panpsychism: the constitutive element, the Russellian element, and the panpsychist element. And then I argue that these three elements jointly entail the cognitive dead end thesis. So because the literature on panpsychism is really rapidly growing, and there are so many complex ideas surrounding panpsychism now, I want to start from the very beginning. I want to start from scratch. I want to start with a common sense view of reality and then see how we can reach constitutive Russellian panpsychism from this very basic common sense view. So let me start with the common sense view of reality and see how we can move from that view to general panpsychism first. So this is the first step. So let's divide reality horizontally into two levels, the macro level and the micro level. So on the macro level, you can find tables and chairs and people and planets and galaxies and so on, and their properties as well. And on the micro level, you can find all sorts of fundamental particles and their properties. And obviously, each level can be divided into further sublevels. So there are almost infinitely many sublevels. And also there are cases where we're not entirely sure if a given object or property should be assigned to the macro level or the micro level, but I'm not gonna worry about these issues here. And also divide reality vertically into two regions, the material region and the phenomenal region. So in the material region, we can find, again, all sorts of material entities and their properties. And in the phenomenal region, we can find phenomenal properties, phenomenal experiences. So now we have four boxes in this picture. So there is the macro material box, the macro phenomenal box, the micro material box, and the micro phenomenal box. And this is the common sense view of reality. So most ordinary people believe that only these three boxes are occupied by something. So they believe that there are macro material properties and entities, so ordinary material entities. They also believe that there are micro material properties and entities. So they are subatomic particles and their properties and so on. And also they believe that there are macro phenomenal properties. So, ordinary people assign phenomenal properties to some macro entities like our brains, for example. So our brains can realize phenomenal properties, macro phenomenal properties, but they don't normally believe that subatomic particles can have consciousness. So that's why the fourth box is empty here. The common sense view can be developed into materialism, dualism, or idealism. So if we go back, so this is a common sense and sense view. And if you accept dualism, you would think that there is a fundamental ontological distinction between the phenomenal region and the material region. But if you are attracted to materialism, you would probably think that macro phenomenal properties ultimately collapse into material properties. So you might think that the macro phenomenal properties supervene on material properties. Panpsychism is in agreement with the common sense view about what exists on the macro level, but not on the micro. So this is Panpsychism. So they ascribe phenomenal properties to micro material entities and properties as well. So they have phenomenal properties on the micro level too. So why should we prefer Panpsychism to the common sense view? One reason is that by endorsing Panpsychism, we can preserve the ontological continuity and homogeneity of reality. So if the common sense view is true, then there are phenomenal properties only on the macro level and in specific parts of the physical universe. So only in our brains and brains of some sentient beings. Only there we can find phenomenal properties. And also, if we look at the history of the universe, it seems a little bit odd that only at specific times in the entire history of the universe we can find phenomenal properties. But if we accept Panpsychism, we have a very elegant picture because phenomenality is everywhere throughout the universe. So phenomenal properties are everywhere. It's not a random thing that we can find in the history of the universe or any special places, special physical locations in the universe. So that was the first step from the common sense view to Panpsychism. And now I want to move from Panpsychism to constitutive Panpsychism. Here's the constitutive Panpsychism. Microphenomenal properties constitute macrophenomenal properties. So just like micromaterial properties constitute macromaterial properties, according to constitutive Panpsychism, microphenomenal properties constitute the macrophenomenal properties. So macrophenomenal properties like our ordinary visual experiences or auditory experiences and so on, these phenomenal experiences are constituted by micro phenomenal experiences. So that's why now we have only two boxes here. So the macrophenomenal properties are constituted by microphenomenal properties. That's why we only have one level now. So why should we prefer constitutive Panpsychism to bare Panpsychism? So one reason is to avoid the expansion of the hard problem of consciousness on all levels. So if we go back to Panpsychism here, now by assigning phenomenal properties to micro entities, Panpsychists have to face the hard problem of micro consciousness as well as macro consciousness. So now the hard problem exists on all levels. But if we accept constitutive Panpsychism, we only need to worry about the hard problem of micro consciousness, because we can simply say that the macrophenomenal properties are constituted by microphenomenal properties. Another reason to prefer constitutive Panpsychism to bare Panpsychism is to avoid strong emergence. It seems impossible to obtain something wholly phenomenal from something wholly material. But constitutive Panpsychism has a good explanation here. So our brains are constituted by little physical entities, and these little entities are already conscious, or at least proto-conscious. So it's not a surprise that when they are arranged in a specific way, they aggregate to yield macro-phenomenal properties. So we can avoid strong emergence in this way. The third step that I want to introduce is a step from constitutive panpsychism to constitutive Russellian panpsychism. So this is the final step to reach constitutive Russellian panpsychism. So we have seen that according to the first two steps, okay, first of all, micro material entities, they have phenomenal properties, and these micro phenomenal properties constitute macro phenomenal properties. So that's constitutive panpsychism. And according to the third step, micro phenomenal properties are inscrutables, which cannot be fully described by physics because their natures are not wholly structural or relational. So this is the Russellian twist that constitutive Russellian panpsychism adopts. So according to this view, consciousness is not a matter of structure and function, and physics can describe only structure and function. And phenomenal properties, they represent inscrutables, which are intrinsic categorical grounds of dispositional properties, which correspond to macro phenomenal properties. So here's an illustration of constitutive Russellian panpsychism. So according to this view, micro material properties and micro phenomenal properties, they are intertwined. So micro phenomenal properties are not totally distinct from micro material properties because they are categorical grounds of micro material properties. And Chalmers succinctly puts this point, saying, according to constitutive Russellian panpsychism, micro phenomenal properties serve as quiddities and also constitute macro phenomenal properties. So why should we prefer constitutive Russellian panpsychism to bare constitutive panpsychism? Constitutive Russellian panpsychism eliminates the hard problem of micro as well as macro consciousness. So now we have this kind of monistic picture. So we don't need to worry about the hard problem of micro consciousness because we don't have any two distinct types of things, such as micro material properties and micro phenomenal properties. They are intertwined and they are integrated. And there is arguably a bonus here, which is that this view offers a solution to the problem of mental causation. So there's a big question about how qualia or phenomenal properties can be causally efficacious in the physical world. But if we accept this Russellian view, then it's not very surprising that phenomenal properties are causally efficacious because, again, they are categorical grounds of dispositional properties. So arguably, this is a bonus for subscribing to Russellian panpsychism. Okay, so we have seen these three steps, and now I argue that these three steps entail what I call a panpsychist dead end. Panpsychism is known to face the combination problem. This is according to some people, this is the greatest challenge for panpsychists. And this problem is concerned with the apparent discrepancy between highly complex structured aggregates of microphenomenal properties on the one hand and smooth, uniform macrophenomenal properties on the other. So our macrophenomenal experiences, so what we are experiencing right now, they seem to be smooth and uniform and homogeneous. But according to constitutive Russellian panpsychism, they are aggregates of little bits of phenomenal properties, microphenomenal properties. But our experiences don't seem to be aggregates of these mini conscious experiences. So how can we obtain macrophenomenal properties from microphenomenal properties? So that's the combination. To solve the combination problem, the following three questions must be answered. What are microphenomenal properties? What are macrophenomenal properties? And how can an aggregate of microphenomenal properties yield macrophenomenal properties? And I argue that we can answer 2, but not 1 and 3. And that would lead us to a cognitive dead end. So I say that we know the answer to question 2 because, again, we constantly experience macrophenomenal properties or experiences. So, even right now, we have all sorts of visual and auditory experiences, and they represent macrophenomenal properties. So at least we have a pretty good grasp of what macrophenomenal properties are. But we don't have any grasp of what microphenomenal properties are and what kind of relationship exists between macrophenomenal properties and microphenomenal properties. So here is an analogy. So a cooking recipe is normally consisted with a list of ingredients, a cooking process, and a complete dish. So here we have a pizza, and that's the dish. And this corresponds to our macrophenomenal experiences, macrophenomenal properties. So we have a pretty good grasp of what the dish is, but the problem is that we don't know what the ingredients are, and we don't know what the cooking process is. And moreover, these ingredients and the cooking process are extremely unusual. So the first problem that would create a cognitive dead end is the ingredient problem. The ingredient problem arises from the first panpsychist step. So the first move from the common sense view to panpsychism. Knowing what it is like to be microphenomenal subjects is more difficult than knowing what it is like to be a bat. So Thomas Nagel famously said, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to know what it is like to be a bat, because bat has a very unique sensory apparatus called sonar. So we don't know, what it is like to be a bat. But knowing what it is like to be a microphenomenal subject, or what it is like to have microphenomenal properties, is more difficult. Because microphenomenal subjects, they don't even have sensory apparatuses or neural systems. Can constitutive Russellian panpsychists avoid the ingredient problem by appealing to proto-phenomenal properties? So sometimes panpsychists talk about, instead of microphenomenal properties, they talk about proto-phenomenal properties. So maybe these subatomic particles, they have proto-phenomenal properties rather than phenomenal properties. But I don't think this move would help because it avoids the problem merely by replacing microphenomenal properties with something that is more elusive, if not more obscure. So proto-phenomenal properties are not phenomenal themselves, but somehow they can aggregate to yield phenomenal properties, and they're not physical properties either. So, it's again, these are mysterious properties, and just by replacing microphenomenal properties with something even more mysterious, we cannot solve the problem. Constitutive Russellian panpsychism is in a worse position than traditional materialism or dualism in this context. So at least traditional materialists and dualists, they don't ascribe phenomenal properties to subatomic particles and things on the micro level. So they don't need to face this problem. They don't have the ingredient problem because they don't claim that full-fledged macrophenomenal properties are constituted by microphenomenal properties. So in this sense, materialism and dualism, they are better than psychism. The only way to know what microphenomenal properties are is to infer it from macrophenomenal properties and the process of producing microphenomenal properties. So again, going back to the cooking analogy, so we know what the dish is, but we don't know what the ingredients are. And sometimes we can do reverse engineering. So we can analyze this pizza and figure out, what kind of ingredients are used. But we cannot adopt this approach here because I think we have a problem called the process problem. The process problem arises from the second and the third steps that we have seen. So the constitutive step and the Russellian step. Now, it seems to me that there is an apparent inconsistency or conflict between constitutivism and Russellianism. Constitutivism says that the microphenomenal properties constitute macrophenomenal properties, which seems to be structural and relational, but the Russellianism says that phenomenal properties are neither structural nor relational. So according to constitutive panpsychism, macrophenomenal properties are constituted by microphenomenal properties, but the Russellianism says that phenomenal properties are not a matter of structure and relation. So it seems that there is some tension between Russellianism and constitutivism. So we have to look for an alternative relationship, some very unusual relationship between macrophenomenal properties and microphenomenal properties. And such a relation should be, first of all, constitutive, because that's the requirement of constitutivism. And it cannot be strong emergence, because we introduce constitutivism precisely because we want to reject strong emergentism. That's the motivation to hold panpsychism. And not causal, spatial-temporal, structural, functional, or dynamic, because they are excluded by the combination problem and the Russellianism. So this is a highly unusual relationship. And Philip Goff proposes a phenomenal bonding relation between macrophenomenal properties and microphenomenal properties. So according to this view, Russellianism holds that fundamental monadic properties like mass and charge can have monadic quiddities underlying them as their categorical bases. Similarly, Russellianism can hold that fundamental monadic relations like spatial-temporal relations can have relational quiddities underlying them as their categorical bases. So the phenomenal bonding relations are relational quiddities underlying ordinary relations that we can find in physics. However, if, as Chalmers says, phenomenal bonding represents if phenomenal bonding represents relational quiddities and underlying monadic relational properties, then we do not have a transparent grasp of such relationships. So, we don't have a transparent grasp of these quiddities. So we don't know what kind of relationships they are. And to comprehend the phenomenal bonding relationship, we have to grasp both microphenomenal properties and macrophenomenal properties. However, the ingredient problem shows that we cannot grasp microphenomenal properties. So again, in order to figure out what the phenomenal bonding relationship is, we can try to do reverse engineering. So we will look at the macrophenomenal properties and analyze them, and look at the microphenomenal properties and analyze them, and we can try to figure out how we can obtain macrophenomenal properties from microphenomenal properties. But again, this kind of reverse engineering is impossible because the ingredient problem suggests that we cannot have any grasp of microphenomenal properties. So again, this is a cooking analogy. So we have to determine what the cooking process is, but we do not know what the ingredients are. We know only what the dish is. And then again, the ingredients are extremely unusual, and the cooking process is also extremely unusual. So somewhat cynically, and I think it's a little bit funny, but Chalmers discusses phenomenal bonding for a long time. And at the end, he says, the biggest question for any phenomenal bonding view is as follows: what is the phenomenal bonding relation? We can stipulate phenomenal bonding. Maybe there are theoretical reasons to think that there is phenomenal bonding, but the ultimate question is, we don't know what this relation is. So here is the conclusion. So it looks like we are facing a catch-22 situation. So to know what the microphenomenal properties are, we have to know first how microphenomenal properties can aggregate to yield the macrophenomenal properties. But yet to know how microphenomenal properties can aggregate to yield macrophenomenal properties, we have to know first what microphenomenal properties are. And the same reasoning applies to cosmopsychism. Cosmopsychism is a mirror image of panpsychism. So this view ascribes phenomenal properties to the cosmos instead of subatomic particles. And by doing so, arguably, they can avoid some of the problems that panpsychism faces. But I say that the same problem applies to cosmopsychism. It might indeed be possible to show through theoretical considerations that microphenomenal properties can aggregate to yield macrophenomenal properties, but constitutive Russellian panpsychism faces a dead end. So we are cognitively unable to show how microphenomenal properties can aggregate to yield macrophenomenal properties. So it seems that what Russellian constitutive Russellian panpsychism is doing is to assume that there are microphenomenal properties, even though we don't know exactly what they are. And then we can also stipulate some unique relationship between microphenomenal properties and macrophenomenal properties. And they can be called phenomenal bonding, but this relationship is again very obscure and mysterious. So we are stipulating two mysterious things to solve the problem. And maybe it is true that these properties exist and there's a unique relationship, but we cannot show how this view can be true, and that's the problem I would like to raise here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and thank you to Yujin for a great introduction to panpsychism and a powerful critique of it. I'm going to continue the critique. I think that both Yujin and I are quite sympathetic to panpsychism, Yujin more than myself probably, but I think we both take it seriously as a position, though we both have strong reservations about it. And it's perhaps a pity that there isn't someone here who's more wholeheartedly committed to it to really defend the position, but I hope we're giving it a fair consideration at any rate. So panpsychism and the de-psychologization of consciousness, I'll explain what I mean by that. Let me give you a quick overview of the paper and of the talk. Just looking through the paper last night, there's quite a lot of detail in it, and so I just want to try and get the main headlines across to you. So here's the overview, and I'll explain it later. The hard problem of consciousness arises when we de-psychologize consciousness. I'll explain what that means in a moment. Panpsychism is an elegant solution to that problem, to the hard problem. And in fact, it's a natural development of the de-psychologized view. So you de-psychologize consciousness, and then panpsychism begins to look very attractive. So the de-psychologization creates a problem, and panpsychism provides a nice solution to it. But panpsychism is a dead end. Some of the reasons Yujin has given, and also for more that I will give. It actually illustrates how implausible de-psychologization is. Okay, so it goes to the root of the problem, I think, that first step, the de-psychologization. So the moral is that we shouldn't de-psychologize consciousness. So as an argument, it goes like this. If you de-psychologize consciousness, then you should be a panpsychist. You shouldn't be a panpsychist. Okay, so let me explain that. We go through then what I mean by de-psychologization, why I say that panpsychism is a natural development of it, why I say that panpsychism is a dead end. De-psychologizing consciousness. Now, I think this is a move that is behind much of the modern debate about consciousness. And it's kind of done almost without noticing it. It's a kind of very natural move to make, although once you spell out its implications, it looks a lot less natural, I think. I kind of think of it as maybe a piece of sleight of hand, possibly. So let's start with two concepts of consciousness. This is implicit in much of the discussion. It's made explicit in the first chapter of David Chalmers' famous book, The Conscious Mind. It's very clear about this, as he always is, about all his assumptions. And it goes something like this. These aren't Chalmers' words, they're my words. We have two concepts, a psychological concept of of mind, of mental states and consciousness. Start with mind. The psychological concept of mind is that of something like a complex behavioral control system, a system that gets inputs from the senses and uses the information, processes the information and uses it to regulate physiological processes, control it, update its own internal states, and guide action, guide behavior. It's a bodily control system, something like that. The phenomenal concept of mind, on the other hand, is that of a sort of world of subjective experience. It's this world in here. It's the thing that Descartes couldn't doubt, and was that we all seem to feel is our most immediate reality. That's mind. Mental state. Here's a mental state. You see, that's what a mental state looks like. It's a mental state is conscious in the psychological sense if it has the right kind of effects on the rest of this control system. Okay, so if the information that it carries is, let's say, globally broadcast to other brain systems who can use it for all sorts of control purposes. So it's broadcast to systems for reasoning, memory, emotion, language, so on and so forth. So if that happens, then the information that the state carries, which might be sensory information about the world, is made available for you, the whole organism, to talk about, think about, report, and so on. It's globally available to brain systems, and therefore, as it were, to you, who are the sum of all those brain systems. So that's what being conscious in the psychological senses. It's this kind of global availability, making it available to the whole system, and thus to you. The mental state is conscious in the phenomenal sense if it has a subjective feel, if it's like something in itself, intrinsically. Okay, I should have made the arrows disappear here. So it's just this sort of inner nature of the state itself, this subjective nature of the state, independent of the effects. It doesn't need to have the effects to have the subjective feel. Now, explaining consciousness in the psychological sense is easy, in the sense that we just have to explain effects. I have to explain processes. I have to explain how the brain can do this stuff, how it can make information available to other systems. Of course, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be immensely difficult, but it's easy in the sense that we can see how to do it in outline. We have to explain how the brain can perform certain functions, make information available to lots of subsystems within it, and use that information to regulate all kinds of aspects of behavior and internal state. But explaining phenomenal consciousness is hard, because how do you explain how the brain generates this internal subjective aspect to what it's doing? So you're tasting coffee or whatever it may be, the information, the sensory information that the taste state contains is made available to other brain systems, so you can report on the taste of the coffee, compare it to other coffees you've tasted, and so on and so forth. That's relatively easy to explain, but what's difficult is to explain why it feels the way it does, why it has the intrinsic feel of the coffee taste. How does the brain produce this apparently ineffable feel, which is of course also private, it's subjective. The psychological processes are all completely public. They can be detected by other people, by neuroimaging and so on. Scientists, the subjective field can't. No one else can observe your subjective fields. That's because they're subjective. Now, that's the way that the problem of consciousness is standardly set up, and we've already made, I think, the key move, which is the depsychologization of consciousness. But why it's we don't always realize that we've made it, because the word phenomenal is a bit tricky, and used in two different ways, I think, when we talk about a state being phenomenally conscious or a person having phenomenally conscious experiences. We use it in a loose sense and a strict sense. In the loose sense, it's just this. It's having experiences that we say are like something, whatever that. Okay, so now I'm kind of happy to say, yeah, I have experiences that are like something. I talk about what my experiences are like and whether this one was nice and that one, wasn't. And I'd say that experience, it's like the one I had yesterday or whatever. Yeah, I would to say that in this loose sense, not really committing myself to any theory of what it is for an experience to be like something. That's the loose sense. And this is the one where you go along with the distinction and say, yeah, well, of course, the experiences are like something. Then there's a stricter sense, which is something like this. Having experiences that are like something, where that property of being like something is understood as an intrinsic property that is of the experience that is distinct from all effects it might have. Okay. And now you see the contrast with the psychological sense implies that. That's what's really involved in making this distinction between psychological and phenomenal. But we tend to read phenomenal in the loose sense and think, well, yeah, that's right. Certainly experiences are like something, but then we've distinguished it from psychological in this using the strict sense of phenomenal. And so we get this idea that just having experiences that are like something in the ordinary sense means that you have a kind of consciousness that can't be conceptualized as merely psychological. Okay, so you've been led to de-psychologize consciousness in that way. It's important to stress here, this is very important, that in the strict sense, conscious experiences are supposed to be, phenomenally conscious experiences are supposed to be, their phenomenal properties are supposed to be distinct from all effects, including effects they might have on introspective processes. Okay, so maybe as well as all these systems for controlling aspects of behavior, we also have introspective processes that can monitor our own brain states. And so maybe when we're in a certain sensory state, we have other systems that can detect the presence of that state and make information about it available to other control systems. So then you'll be able to recognize when you're in the state. You'll be able to report that you're in the state. You'll be able to compare different states. You'll be able to do a lot of reflection on the state. You might even be tempted to say, this state is like something because it's like that one I had yesterday. All in virtue of psychological processes involving internal monitoring. Okay, now phenomenal consciousness is supposed to be distinct from all that as well as distinct from the other psychological processes involved. So this distinction, because the idea is that you can imagine all of those processes and all of the reactions that they generate, all of these introspective processes and the reactions that they generate, all of that occurring without there actually being any intrinsic feel. Okay, the thought is that the intrinsic feel is something essential to the state, and it could be present or not present regardless of what else the state is doing, what other effect it's having on the rest of the system. So we could imagine a creature with a kind of rich sort of self-monitoring who has a sense of subjectivity, if you like, which talks about its own mental states and what they're like and so on, but still doesn't have phenomenal consciousness in this sense. Phenomenal consciousness is supposed to be something distinct from all psychological actions, including introspective ones. The phenomenal consciousness in a strict sense has no a priori connections with psychological processes or reactions. It could be, as some materialists say, that it actually is just a psychological state, but the point here is that the concept is not of any of a psychological state. It's a concept of something distinct from all that. Okay, it's conceptually distinct. It might turn out later that it's the same as materialists hold, but then of course you've got to make that identity plausible. But we start off with a conception of consciousness that is thoroughly de-psychologized, has no connections with psychological processes, including introspective ones. That's implicit in the initial distinction, but it's sometimes sneaked in by using a loose sense of phenomenal consciousness. Okay, the concept is thoroughly de-psychologized. And what that means is that once we start trying to theorize about what phenomenal consciousness is, we've got to beware of psychologizing bias. What I mean by psychologizing bias is the tendency to think that only creatures that have certain psychological capacities have phenomenal consciousness. Okay, because there's no reason to think that now. We've severed the connection. So now there's no reason to think that you need to have certain psychological capacities in order to have phenomenal consciousness. No a priori. And to think so is psychologizing bias, and people who believe in phenomenal consciousness in this strict sense have to beware of that. And I don't think they are. Okay. Oh gosh, I need to hurry up. From depsychologized consciousness to panpsychism, well, the first thing to notice is that once you have this depsychologized concept of consciousness, then the path to panpsychism is open. If we depsychologize consciousness, then there's no reason to suppose that only animate things have it, only things that have some, a psychological system have it. So, it would be absurd to think that electrons, say, have consciousness in the psychological sense, that they have little sort of internal control systems that get sensory information and use it to regulate their behavior. That would be absurd. And I think a lot of the, maybe some of the criticism that panpsychism gets comes from people sort of tacitly supposing that that's what panpsychists are claiming. They're not. So it's absurd to suggest that electrons are conscious in the psychological sense. This is an absurd picture. It's from Wikipedia there. This isn't what panpsychism is. It isn't the idea that protons, electrons, and neutrons have some sort of psychology. It's not absurd, though, to suggest that they have consciousness in the phenomenal sense, that they have some sort of intrinsic phenomenal feel to them, because that has no connection with any psychological processes, no conceptual connection with any psychological processes. A thing doesn't have to do anything in order to have an intrinsic phenomenal feel. It just has to exist. And electrons exist. I suppose we could get into debates in scientific realism there, but let's assume they do. And moreover, the path is attractive. I don't need to spell this out because Yujin has already done this. The case for constitutive Russellian panpsychism is quite attractive. Panpsychism, because it would be arbitrary to suppose that this intrinsic nature just appears in certain bits of nature and not elsewhere. Why should it just appear in brains? Why should it just appear in psychological systems? We've depsychologized it. There's no reason to suppose that it's only restricted to those systems. That's psychologizing bias. So why shouldn't it be everywhere? Elegance. It's more elegant, this is the constitutive bit, to suppose that the rich human consciousness is built up from simpler components in the way that other complex structures in nature are. And explanation, the Russellian element, as Yujin explained, explains the relation between the phenomenal and the physical. The phenomenal is the intrinsic nature of the physical. So it's the intrinsic nature of the basic elementary particles. That solves the hard problem. Then you combine these elementary particles to get brains. At the same time, their intrinsic natures fuse to form a macro consciousness. And there you have it. You've solved the hard problem, and you've got a kind of elegant picture of the place of consciousness in the world. In fact, I would say that panpsychism is the obvious way to develop a depsychologized view of consciousness. If you have a depsychologized view, then you really should go down this path. I think I'm absolutely with the panpsychists on that. I think the path's open and natural, and I think it's far more elegant than the alternative, such as property dualism. And so, in fact, I would say that it takes depsychologization seriously. In a way that other attempts to address the hard problem don't. Still, I think it's a dead end. Now, take a little more time over this. Yujin's already explained one reason for thinking it's a dead end. the combination problem. Many aspects to this. Yujin discussed several. Well, he outlined a problem that really goes to the heart, I think, of the combination problem, the different aspects of the combination problem. So I won't say any more about that. But I will say a little bit more about the problems for creating a panpsychist science of consciousness. I think some panpsychists suggest that we can actually extend our science of consciousness by using panpsychism as a foundation for it. I don't think we can. I don't think we can make any progress with a panpsychist science. The problem is that these properties that we're dealing with here, these intrinsic phenomenal properties, are just so anomalous. They're like nothing elsewhere in science. It's tempting, I think, to think that they're, well, look, let's say that what makes them anomalous is, let me say that again. First of all, they're unobservable. Okay, these things are not publicly observable. Okay, so that's one obstacle. And you might think from that, well, that's not a problem because science often deals with unobservables, black holes and electrons, and quarks, and so on. You know, science is full of concepts of unobservables. The trouble is that those unobservables are posited to explain things that are publicly observable. So you start with a bunch of observations, try to explain them, you posit unobservables to explain those observables. That's not what phenomenal properties are. They're not posited to explain any publicly observable data. All of that can be done without mentioning them. They're posited to provide some metaphysical basis for the things that are for the theoretical posits that are mentioned by physics. So physics posits things like electrons and so on, and to explain the data of observation. And we posit phenomenal properties, micro phenomenal properties, to provide some sort of metaphysical basis for those theoretical entities. But it doesn't. We don't need to posit that in order to explain their behavior. Physics can do that without mentioning them. Now they are supposed. So in fact, phenomenal properties are not really theoretical posits at all. They're supposed to be concepts of observables. Okay. The trouble is that they're only observable from one perspective, from the first person perspective. They're not publicly observable. And they're publicly unobservable observables. Okay. I don't think there's any parallel in science for anything like that. If you can point me to one, I'd be interested. I'll point me to a comparison, but I don't think there's anything like that. And one consequence of that is that we just can't do science on them. Science just can't get a grip on something like that. It's often suggested that one way we could get a handle on this is by looking for the neural correlates of phenomenal consciousness. So we look for the brain states that correlate with particular macro phenomenal states. Okay, so then if we could do that, if we could find a correlation between the two, then that would at least give us some grip on how the phenomenal properties map onto physical ones. Maybe we could start to look for some sort of structure in there that's common between the physical state and the phenomenal state, which might give us some idea about how they break down. Possibly might give us some grip on how we could start addressing the problem that that Yujin mentioned. We can't do that. We can't establish these correlations. We cannot find the neural correlates of phenomenal consciousness itself for the simple reason that we can't observe it. All we can find are the neural correlates of reactions that we assume to be associated with phenomenal consciousness, saying that I see it, saying that pressing a button to indicate that I've noticed it, pupil dilation, whatever it might be, eye direction, whatever. That's all we can observe. And that's all we can ever find the neural correlates of, these reactions. And what justifies the assumption that those reactions are associated with phenomenal consciousness? That's another example of psychologizing bias. There are reactions associated with consciousness in the psychological sense, in the use of the information that the state contains. We've severed any conceptual connection between those reactions and phenomenality itself. So we've no right to that assumption. The assumption is psychologizing bias. Moreover, the same would go for a self-experimenter. Suppose you think you can get around this by doing the experiment on yourself, so that you can directly observe your own phenomenal states, and you lie in a scanner and you can look at the image generated by the brain scanner, and you look at the image generated by the brain scanner, and you try and make a comparison between what you're experiencing and what's on the scanner. It won't work, because still, in order to do that, you have to enter various psychological states. You have to notice that you're in a certain phenomenal state, decide to correlate that with the image on the scanner, notice what's on the scanner, and so all sorts of psychological processes have to occur to mediate this comparison. And it may be that it's the correlates of those that you're seeing on the scanner, not the correlates of phenomenal consciousness itself. Maybe that phenomenal consciousness, the correlate of phenomenal consciousness, just one neuron firing, and all the rest is the correlate of the psychological processes involved in your trying to do the comparison. Even in your own state, you can't pierce through your own psychology and encounter your phenomenology raw. Or if you can, you can't do anything with it. You can't do any experiment on it, even if it's, as soon as you start to do experiments, as soon as you start to think, you're into the world of psychology. Okay, I'm aware that I'm running out of time. Can I just have, say, another 5 minutes or so, because I want to get onto some deeper problems here. Definitely. You might say, is that okay, Jakob?
Definitely.
Great. So it's taking longer than I thought. So the response to that, panpsychists might say, okay, well, we can't really do science. Fair enough. We never really claimed we could. It's metaphysics. What we're trying to do is, this stuff exists. We need to find a place for it in the world. That's a metaphysical problem. It's not going to interfere with science. It's just going to provide a sort of grounding for physics, and it's going to kind of explain why we have this this private world. But it's not going to change any of the anything that psychologists or neuroscientists say. So it's just a metaphysical theory, and we arrive at it by sort of broadly a priori means, by just reflecting on what seems like the most elegant account. Well, okay, you can say that, but don't then say that it's a science. Even if we accept that, I think there are still problems, in fact even more serious problems for panpsychism. Here's one. Thinking about conscious subjects, first of all, about the individuals, whatever they are, that are the subjects of conscious experience. Now, we assume that conscious subjects are relatively rare. Of the things around us, only a few are conscious subjects. I am, you are, a good many animals are, we're not sure quite which. Are spiders, I don't know, are fish, don't know, dogs, yes. So we assume they're relatively rare. Most things aren't conscious subjects, and we assume they're ethically significant. It matters. If I kick my table, that's not ethically problematic. If I kick a dog, that is. Panpsychism entails that they're neither, because it entails that electrons are conscious subjects. That conscious subjects are they're absolutely, they're ubiquitous. And we can't possibly treat electrons as ethically significant. It's just, there's no way we could extend our ethical concept of electrons. Now, panpsychists might say, okay, well, look, we're not claiming that all conscious subjects are ethically significant. We accept that micro subjects are ubiquitous and not of ethical concern. But macro conscious subjects, that's different. They are. When a lot of these micro subjects combine to form a macro consciousness like ours, that's ethically significant, and there won't be a lot of these around. Okay, so we can preserve our common sense intuitions. Well, how would we know that? How would we know that's true? How do we know that rocks and trees and tables and stars and books and computers and so on are not macro subjects? How do we know? How do we know that they're micro, the micro consciousnesses of the elements that compose them don't fuse to form a macro consciousness? How do we know? It's tempting to assume that there's a phenomenal psychological parallel again. So it's only things that show signs of consciousness in the psychological sense, that behave as if they're conscious, that are phenomenally conscious, and that have a macro consciousness. But that's just psychologizing bias again. That's assuming that that there's some sort of conceptual connection between phenomenality and certain sorts of effects, certain sorts of reactions, psychological and behavioral. And we're not supposed to suppose that. Of course, you might say, well, okay, it's not a conceptual truth, but it could be an empirical one. Maybe we discover that they are. That macro consciousness only occurs where features that have a rich psychology. Again, how do you test that? You can't. Indeed, there's a case for thinking that all combinations of elementary particles, any random combination of elementary particles, should form a macro subject. Philip Goff had a really nice argument for this in a paper a few years ago. He's repudiated the argument now, but I still think it's a nice argument. I mentioned it in the paper. So I don't see what reason a panpsychist has, other than relying on psychologizing bias, to think that rocks aren't conscious. And if they can't justify that claim, then panpsychism doesn't vindicate our intuitions about conscious subjects. Okay, coming to the last couple of slides now. I'll now turn to conscious experiences. I don't think it vindicates our intuitions about conscious experiences either. I make a couple of 2 or 3 points in the paper, but I'll focus on just one. We assume that we're aware of our conscious experiences, right? That's implicit in calling them conscious, I guess. When I have a conscious pain, I'm aware of it. Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that pain, in the phenomenal sense, is the intrinsic nature of the brain state that causes pain reactions. Okay, now you may think, well, that's just psychologizing bias, and it is. But let's let the panpsychist have that claim, because it's a claim that many panpsychists want to have, because they want to say that the phenomenal pain has a causal role. And it can only do that if it's the intrinsic nature of the brain state that actually plays the causal role. Okay. So let's let them have that claim. I don't think it becomes any better for them if we take a different view. I think the same points would go through anyway, but let's let them have that claim. So phenomenal pain is the intrinsic nature of the brain state that causes pain reactions. Would we be aware of that pain? Well, here's a plausible claim. Awareness requires a causal mechanism. To be aware of something, I need to have some sort of mechanism that detects it and alerts me to its presence. I mean, my body has all sorts, and this goes both for features of the world and for features of myself. My brain and body have all kinds of properties that I have no inkling of. The only ones that I know of are ones that I have some internal system for detecting. And so I can detect damage to my body because I have pain receptors in my body, and they send signals to my brain. I detect things in the world because I have external sensors and so on. Now, we can be sure that our brains do not have mechanisms that can detect the intrinsic nature of their own states. We can be certain of that because these internal natures are not publicly detectable. The brain evolution could no more build a detector for the intrinsic nature of other brain states than a human engineer could. my brain can no more detect the intrinsic nature of another part of itself than it can detect the intrinsic nature of somebody else's brain. You can't build a detector for intrinsic natures. All that an internal brain system could detect are the effects of other brain states. Okay, so it could tell that this state is having the effects associated with pain, but it couldn't tell that it had the intrinsic nature of pain. And if it can't detect it, then of course it can't make information about it available to other brain systems so that the whole organism is aware of it. It can't make it available to language so we can report it, to memory so we can remember it, to reasoning so we can think about it, and so on, and to emotion so we can react to it emotionally. We can't do anything with it, with that intrinsic field. Now, the panpsychists may say, well, I'm sure they would say, we don't need a mechanism to detect these fields. Conscious subjects are immediately acquainted with their phenomenal properties. Okay, so you have something that has an intrinsic nature, and that thing is immediately acquainted with its own intrinsic nature, its own phenomenal properties, just by being the thing it is. That's the claim, they'll say. Don't need a mechanism. Okay, I agree. The trouble is that in this case, the subject that's acquainted with the pain isn't me. It's one of my brain states. So maybe my C fibers may be aware that they're in pain, but I'm not, because there's no way that information can be made available to other brain systems. And if it's not, then I, the whole organism, can't do anything with it. It's not available to me. I don't know what my experiences are like. And if that's the conclusion we come to, then something has gone deeply wrong somewhere. And it went wrong right at the start with trying to de-psychologize consciousness. Okay, I'm just about done. I'll just finish with this thought experiment here, which that is an image from a root canal, not a root canal, a wisdom tooth extraction that I had last week. And I can assure you that when people say that, I deny the reality of pain, I don't. I can still feel it. Okay, so here's the analogy. Here's the thought experiment. You're going to have, let's say, a wisdom tooth extracted, have a choice of two anesthetics. Whichever you take, your pain receptors will still fire and you'll still enter the brain state that's associated with pain. Okay. Now, the first anesthetic will prevent that state from having any effects on the rest of your brain. But it won't prevent it. It won't affect its intrinsic nature. It will still have whatever intrinsic nature it has. If this is some sort of phenomenal pain, it will still have that. But you, the whole organism, won't have any pain-related reactions, psychological or behavioral. You won't believe you're in pain. You won't want the procedure to stop. You won't feel afraid. You won't struggle. You won't cry out. And when it's over, you won't be left with any memories of anything bad having happened. And so I can spell this out in endless detail. No psychological, physiological, well, I suppose there might be some physiological reactions if they were correct, if they were produced by the spinal cord, but no higher reactions of any kind, psychological or behavioral. Now, the second anesthetic will do the opposite. It will somehow dispel the state's intrinsic nature. Maybe it will cause all the little micro consciousnesses that fuse together to form the pain field, will cause them to decombine temporarily. So they'll just go back to being discrete little particle consciousnesses. But it won't inhibit the state's effects on the rest of your brain, on the rest of your psychology. So you'll still have all the pain-related reactions. You'll be absolutely convinced that you're in pain. You'll desperately desire for it to stop. You'll be afraid. You will be shaking and trembling and crying out, begging for the thing to stop. You will be left at the end of it with traumatic memories, all the normal psychological, all the usual psychological and behavioral responses to pain. Okay, so the question is, which would you take? Which is the pain that matters to you? Is it the psychologized one that consists in all the reactions, or the de-psychologized one that you could share with an electron? where are you in this picture? Where is your consciousness? And I think, for me, I'm with the psychologized consciousness. That's where I am. That's for you to decide. So sorry I ran over a bit there, but that's the talk.